Welcome to News from Neptune for April 12th, in the 15th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. That begins by calling things by their right names, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism." Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society is one form or another of state capitalism today. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China notably. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says that the U.S. media either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things today on a Martyrdom of Julian Assange and Press Freedom edition of News from Neptune. On March 26th, WikiLeaks Twitter accounts announced that President Moreno of Ecuador was being investigated by Ecuador's Congress for corruption. The INA papers WikiLeaks refers to in its tweet are documents leaked to an Ecuadorian politician that have implicated President Lenin Moreno in a corruption scandal. The WikiLeaks statement comes 2 days after Mr. Moreno accused Mr. Assange of repeatedly violating the terms of his asylum and said Quito, the Ecuador capital, was seeking an arrangement with Britain to allow him to leave the embassy. Ecuador also suspects that WikiLeaks is responsible for recently sharing private photographs of Mr. Moreno on social media. Mr. Assange's relations with his embassy hosts have deteriorated in the past year. Last year, Ecuador cut off his internet and issued a 9-page memo demanding he steer clear of sensitive topics and concentrating on the well-being, food, hygiene, and proper care of his cat. Now, it's not hard to imagine what Ecuador was doing here and who was putting pressure on Ecuador to shut Assange up. But now the embassy has been invaded by British police. Assange was dragged, literally, from the embassy and put in prison, put in jail, pending extradition to the United States. So we're in the midst of an amazing assault on the freedom of the press, and Assange has become a figure, a martyr indeed, to that process. It's hard to talk about too much else today because it's a central issue that involves the criminality of the major Western governments, the United States in the lead, of course, but it has allies.
Well, it's a feast of both wisdom and nonsense on the internet this morning, or at least some perceptivity and a lot of nonsense. One, in case you missed what's going on the Real News Network, Carl, when Assange was dragged out of there, he was carrying a book. Have you heard this?
No, I haven't.
He was carrying a copy of Gore Vidal book.
I did hear that.
Actually, a collection of interviews that Paul Jay, the director of the Real News Network, did with him obviously many years ago, because Vidal has been gone for some time, and about the national security state. And so there was an interview with Paul Jay by one of the other Real News reporters this morning talking about that book and talking about Gore Vidal and what he was saying in those interviews. And there was also a very good interview with Daniel Ellsberg about this whole issue, about a 20-minute interview with Ellsberg, extremely supportive of, or extremely critical of what's happening, and extremely supportive of what Assange has been up to all these years and of WikiLeaks. And
Ellsberg's important here, of course,
yeah.
because he was the man who delivered the Pentagon Papers, that is, the Pentagon's account of the Vietnam War, top secret documents, to the Washington Post, and survived a court challenge in the U.S. about the publication of those documents. Ellsberg contends that the materials that WikiLeaks had published are equivalent to the Pentagon Papers, and if one is able to be criminalized, then the other will be too.
What Jonathan Cook, the journalist residing, the British journalist who lives in and covers in Israel, Palestine, what he said this morning in his Counterpunch article was, this was never about Sweden or bail violations, or even about the discredited Russiagate narrative, as anyone who was paying the vaguest attention should have been able to work out. It was about the U.S. deep state doing everything in its power to crush WikiLeaks and to make an example of its founder. It was about making sure there would never again be a leak like that of Collateral Murder, capital C, capital M, which was turned out to be a video. The military video released by WikiLeaks in 2007 that showed U.S. soldiers celebrating as they murdered Iraqi civilians. It was about making sure that there would never be a dump of U.S. diplomatic cables like those released in 2010 that revealed the secret machinations of the U.S. empire to dominate the planet, whatever the cost in human rights violations. End quote of that part of Jonathan Cook's article.
It's clear what's at stake here. I mean, it is nothing less than the freedom of the press, the freedoms guaranteed supposedly by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and the blatant attempt by the U.S. government to suppress any effective use of those supposed freedoms, namely to expose the crimes of the U.S. government. The attempt at suppression couldn't be more obvious, and Assange has become a symbol of that because of the work that WikiLeaks did in refusing, in publicizing the crimes of that government, and that government is bound and determined that it shan't happen again.
And let's look at how the liberal press is dealing with this in the worst sense of the word. And for that, we, of course, only have to turn to the New York Times and to Michelle Goldberg's, the quintessential liberal feminist, 1 inch to the left of Hillary Clinton columnist in the paper this morning. I could almost write it myself.
We're so used to it.
Listen to the waffling. While I'm reading this, listen to the waffling. Listen to the liberal whirring going on, the wheels turning in her mind. Quote: elements of the Assange indictment could set a dangerous precedent. I don't say that out of any sympathy for Assange, an odious person who initially sought refuge in the embassy to dodge charges stemming from an alleged sexual assault in Sweden. In the 2016 election, Assange acted as a conduit. It isn't too long here.
Right.
Assange acted as a conduit for Russian intelligence services that had hacked emails from top Democrats. He helped spread the conspiracy theory that the leaked Democratic emails were actually released by Seth Rich, who worked for the Democratic National Committee and who was murdered in 2016. Surely Assange knew this wasn't true. There is ample evidence of his misogyny and anti-Semitism, and there's a couple of links that she goes that she gives to in terms of his anti-Semitism. not terribly convincing, but anyway, he might be known as an information anarchist. But by helping Trump become president, and there's the key, by helping Trump become president, he became a handmaiden to authoritarianism.
Oh,
So Assange may well deserve to go to prison. What's troubling, the caveat in the last liberal sentence here, what's troubling, however, is that his indictment treats ordinary news gathering processes as elements of a criminal conspiracy. So she's willing to concede that this is troubling and that might set a bad precedent. But, Assange is so odious and has so much going against him that we perhaps shouldn't waste that much time being concerned with his fate.
and he didn't clean up after his cat, right?
Yeah, right, of course.
The glimpse of Julian Assange being dragged from the Ecuadorian embassy in London is an emblem of the times. Might against right, muscle against the law, indecency against courage. 6 policemen, British cops, manhandled a sick journalist, his eyes wincing against his first natural light in almost 7 years. That this outrage happened in the heart of London, in the land of Magna Carta, ought to shame and anger all who fear for democratic societies, democratic in quotes. Assange is a political refugee protected by international law, the recipient of asylum under a strict covenant to which Britain is a signatory. The United Nations made this clear in the legal ruling of its working party on arbitrary detention. But to hell with that. Let the thugs go in. Directed by the quasi-fascists in Trump's Washington, in league with Ecuador's Lenin Moreno, the president, a Latin American Judas and liar seeking to disguise his rancid regime, the British elite abandoned its last imperial myth, that of fairness and justice. Imagine Tony Blair dragged from his multi-million-pound Georgian home in Connaught Square, London, in handcuffs for onward dispatch to the dock in The Hague. By the standards of Nuremberg, Blair's paramount crime is the death of 1 million Iraqis. Assange's crime is journalism, holding the rapacious to account, exposing their lies, and empowering people all over the world with truth. The shocking arrest of Assange carries a warning for all who, as Oscar Wilde wrote, sow the seeds of discontent without which there would be no advance towards civilization. The warning is explicit towards journalists. What happened to the founder and editor of WikiLeaks can happen to you on a newspaper, you in a TV studio, you on radio, you running a podcast. Assange's principal media tormentor, the Guardian newspaper of London, a collaborator with the secret state, displayed its nervousness this week with an editorial that scaled new weasel heights. The Guardian had exploited the work of Assange and WikiLeaks in what its previous editor called the greatest scoop of the last 30 years. The paper creamed off WikiLeaks' revelations and claimed the accolades and riches that came with them. With not a penny going to Julian Assange or to WikiLeaks, a hyped Guardian book led to a lucrative Hollywood movie. The book's authors, Luke Harding and David Lee, turned on their source, abused him, and disclosed the secret password Assange had given the paper in confidence, which was designed to protect a digital file containing leaked U.S. embassy cables. With Assange now trapped in the Ecuadorian embassy, Harding, the reporter, joined the police outside and gloated on his blog that, quote, Scotland Yard may get the last laugh, close quote. The Guardian has since published a series of falsehoods about Assange, not least a discredited claim that a group of Russians and Trump's man Paul Manafort had visited Assange in the embassy. The meetings never happened. It was fake. But the tone has now changed. The Assange case is a morally tangled web, the Guardian of the paper opined. He, Assange, believes in publishing things that should not be published, but he has always shone a light on things that should never have been hidden. These things are the truth about the homicidal way America conducts its colonial wars, the lies of the British Foreign Office and its denial of rights to vulnerable people, such as the Chagos Islanders, the expose of Hillary Clinton as a backer and beneficiary of jihadism in the Middle East, the detailed description of American ambassadors, of how the governments in Syria and Venezuela might be overthrown, and much more. It's all available on the WikiLeaks site. The Guardian newspaper is understandably nervous. Secret policemen have already visited the newspaper and demanded and got the ritual destruction of a hard drive that had this illegal information on it. They filmed breaking up the hard drive in the basement of the Guardian because it had illegal material in it. In 1983, a British Foreign Office clerk, Sarah Tisdall, leaked British government documents showing when American cruise nuclear weapons would arrive in Europe. The Guardian was showered with praise. When a court order demanded to know the source, instead of the editor going to prison on a fundamental principle of protecting a source, Tisdall was betrayed, prosecuted, and served 6 months in jail. If Assange is extradited to America for publishing what The Guardian calls truthful things, what is to stop the current editor of The Guardian following him, or the previous editor, or the prolific propagandist Luke Harding? What is to stop the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post, who also publish morsels of the truth that originated with WikiLeaks, and the editor of El Pais in Spain, the leading newspaper, and Der Spiegel in Germany, and the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia? The list is long. In other words, this is a general assault on the revelation of American crimes. The U.S. government is thinking big. David McCraw, lead lawyer of the New York Times, wrote, quote, "I think the prosecution of Assange would be a very, very bad precedent for publishers. From everything I know, he's sort of in a classic publisher's position, and the law would have a very hard time distinguishing between the New York Times and WikiLeaks." It's not clear this guy still works for the New York Times, but that was a legal opinion some months ago about the parallels or the lack of difference between what Assange has done and what the New York Times has done. But the U.S. has arranged 6 years of imprisonment for Assange for that. Even if journalists who publish WikiLeaks leaks are not summoned by an American grand jury, other than Assange, of course, the intimidation of Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning will be enough. Real journalism is being criminalized by thugs in plain sight. Dissent has become an indulgence. Real journalism is an enemy of these disgraces. A decade ago, the Ministry of Defense in London produced a secret document which described the principal threats to public order as threefold: 1, terrorists; 2, Russian spies; and 3, investigative journalists. The latter was designated the major threat. So they're acting on this activity is nothing new, so to speak, in the minds of the people who run the British and American governments. It's a result of policy. And it's not an isolated case. It's not an attempt to say that Julian Assange is a peculiarly egregious example of this publication of things that the governments don't want published. He's rather an example of exactly that, who should be suppressed as a message to other publications, even including the New York Times. Not that the New York Times and the Washington Post seem to be needing much reminder on this point. They're willing to do what they're told by the governments of the U.S. and the U.K., but the principle needs to be established publicly here, and Assange is the martyr to that principle, the way in which that principle would be established. It's a very bad time and an important case.
So what you just read, was that John Pilger?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So John Pilger on Counterpunch this morning also, with a long article near the top or at the top.
Yes, that's what I was quoting from.
Yeah, right, okay. And so I guess a couple of issues that...
Actually, since we mentioned the fact that Pilger himself, an aged Australian journalist, ends this piece that we've been quoting with an interesting personal story.
Right.
He says, in the 1970s, I met Leni Riefenstahl, Leni Riefenstahl, close friend of Adolf Hitler, whose films helped cast the Nazi spell over Germany. She told me that the message in her films, the propaganda, was dependent not on orders from above, but on what she called the submissive void of the public. Quote, did this submissive void include the liberal educated bourgeoisie? I asked her. Of course, she said, especially the intelligentsia. When people no longer ask serious questions, they are submissive and malleable. Anything can happen. And did. The rest, she might have added, is history.
So one thing one question that interests me about this is the sort of transition from post-Russiagate to Assange's arrest in London. And
I'm not sure Russiagate has ever gone away.
Yeah,
so
well, it hasn't. And I mean, actually, early this week, I copied and pasted this quote that I thought I would actually lead with about Russiagate prior to Assange, but I'm thinking about what the relationships there are between how Russiagate is playing out, post-Russiagate is playing out, or post-Mueller is playing out, in especially the liberal press, along with this, and how these might even relate to each other in a more even causal kind of way. What Matt Taibbi wrote, one quote from what Matt Taibbi wrote in a long column called Hate Inc. The modern media business is all about identifying demographics and serving them a steady diet of affirming opinion. If you feel negatively about any group or subject, we will serve you information that enhances that feeling. When you're angry, we'll make you angrier. When you feel you're thinking on your own too much, we'll nudge you back towards the sensational and the non-reflective. The goal is to keep you spinning in an endless cycle of disgust and impotent anger. It's the ultimate Orwellian trick, a consumer business in which the product is your own frustration. You are the power source. The unhappier you are, the more money we make. And I would only add just two more points. This Luke Harding character referred to a couple of times.
Right.
He was the guy that, in the process of the Russiagate mess, Aaron Mate, when Aaron was working at the Real News Network, he got an interview with Luke Harding, which I'm not sure how it went along for. Half an hour or so, or maybe longer, and Luke Harding ended up ending it, ended up hanging up on him, because Aaron was so assertive and so had him cornered, basically.
Yeah, it made him look so bad. Yes,
it made him look so bad that he was basically just forced to just hang up on him. He wasn't the only person that Aaron Mate did this in relation to his just debunking of the whole Russiagate thing when he was at the Real News Network, but I'm not sure that anybody else actually hung up on him. I think this other guy, Craig Unger, might have sort of ended it in a kind of huff, but Marcy Wheeler was relatively nice to him, hung in there with him. But anyway,
And then wrote nasty things afterwards.
Yeah, but you know, and you know, the other thing is, if you look at the Michelle Goldberg column in the New York Times, read the comments. You know, read the most recommended comments. You know, click the most reader recommended or whatever it says, and you'll find that the liberal narrative, the post-Russiagate narrative, is really dominating this. What Assange did was helped elect Trump.
Right.
That's what the highly rated comments are saying about to justify what's happened in the last day.
There are parts of this arrangement that are very difficult to believe. Our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson, has found an absolutely incredible piece from Aaron Maté, who we were just mentioning. Aaron Maté being the journalist who's done more perhaps than any other American journalist to expose the the Russiagate nonsense. But he's outdone himself, so to speak, in the following point that Jeff Nicholson provides for us. He talks about a group called New Knowledge. New Knowledge is a bot, practically. New Knowledge report has a section on the Russians' asset development. Recruiting an asset, this is what the New Knowledge people say, recruiting an asset by exploiting a personal vulnerability, they write, is a timeless espionage practice. This is their first example of the espionage practice. Unclear if it yielded any assets. Now, got to understand what's going on here. This is New Knowledge, a media group that is providing accounts of how Russians are undermining our political discourse, to say nothing of our natural body fluids. They have put together an announcement, an announcement of how an asset can be recruited by a supposed Russian agent by exploiting a personal vulnerability. The examples they use are the following, and I'm not making this up. The connection to Maté's column will be on our Facebook page. Quote, struggling with the addiction to masturbation? Reach out to me and we will beat it together. Signed, Jesus. Now, this is, this, according to the New Knowledge group, the media group, is a way in which Russian intelligence recruits assets, people favorable to the Russian propaganda that will undermine our elections. They continue, quote, you can't hold hands with God when you are masturbating. Use our hotline if you need help, close quote. Now, this is not only simple madness, it also comes with the imprimatur of the U.S. Senate via a Senate report where the Senate signs on to New Knowledge's claims. The claim is these are things the Russians are doing to undermine our political system. Jeff Nicholson suggests, and I think he may be right, that the Russians who put the Jesus line in the graphic, and there is a graphic for this, together need to be hired writing American comedy TV shows. That's just good comedy. But that was also the top ad chosen to exemplify alleged Russian social media ad-based interference in the U.S. 2016 election. Sober analysts Gerald Nadler and Hillary Clinton compared this to Pearl Harbor. Now, you have to see this to believe it. New Knowledge, the organization that put this together, was started by a couple of former government operatives, Jonathan Morgan, a former special advisor to the State Department, and Ryan Fox, who, quote, spent 15 years at the NSA as a counterterrorism fellow and NSA representative European SIGINT partner, who served under U.S. Joint Special Operations Command as a CNO analyst for the U.S. Army, to quote their new knowledge bios once published on their website. This is the group that's putting out this supposed Russian disinformation. These two grifters realize that they can make many times more money if they work in the private sector rather than for the NSA. They did that and got caught creating fake Russian bot accounts in order to make it seem like Americans backing anti-Democratic Party interests or campaigns were somehow being misled by the Russians and thus giving fictional ground to Russiagate. And I mean, they can sell this better to the U.S. government. The New York Times and other corporate media outlets gave their work cover for a while. I mean, didn't tell that they knew that this was an American con job, till it became obvious that they were the source of what was being investigated as Russian disinformation in the 2016 U.S. election. Hamilton 68, funded by NATO and U.S. aid, were one of these fake groups. There's more about this in terms of the New Knowledge people and their attempt to undermine the the Alabama election last year. This is what is being presented to us as Russian interference with the American elections, and it's being done not just by the American government, which is sponsoring this, but by these con men who are literally making money from it. The actual effect is minimal at best. New Knowledge's report was cited in the Senate discussion of Russian involvement. Aaron Matei, the reporter who we're quoting here, pointed out in The Nation that an estimated 10 million people in the U.S. saw the Russian ads. 44% of total ad impressions, number of times ads were displayed, were before the election in 2016, and 56% were after the election. Didn't matter. And just, the Russians are doing bad stuff to influence the election. A lot of it happened after the election, but that doesn't matter because, of course, the Russians are doing bad stuff to influence the election. It wasn't the Russians. Roughly 25% of the ads were never shown to anyone. That's because advertising auctions are designed so that ads reach people based on relevance, what you put on your Facebook page and so forth, and certain ads may not reach anyone at all as a result. For 50% of the ads, less than $3 was spent. For 99% of the ads, less than $1,000 was spent. This was Russiagate. This was the mass Russia campaign, and turns out to be done by American con men.
It's kind of interesting how the liberal to left journalistic world is kind of moving on this. So we had Michelle Goldberg going from the Nation, where Katrina vanden Heuvel, who knows what she would be if she weren't married to Stephen Cohen, who has the scholar, the Russia scholar, who has worked to debunk a lot of this Russiagate nonsense. So Aaron Matei moved from the Real News Network, where he did good work on the Russiagate issue, to the Nation, where he has published the article that presume the article that you referred to. And so the Nation, which otherwise might be a little more mealy-mouthed about this stuff, but we'll have to see how the Nation, how that particularly manifestation of liberal to left thinking, how that plays out in relation to Julian Assange. But anyway, if you want to hear more of what Matei was saying after after the Russiagate business. He did long interviews on a couple of the podcasts that I regularly listen to, one with Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton. Their one is called Moderate Rebels, and the other one is with Ronnie Akalik and Kevin Gosztola, and that one is called Unauthorized Disclosure. So you can find out, you can listen to him doing his sort of victory lap regarding Russiagate.
I hope it's not premature.
Yeah.
Jeff Nicholson continues with the comment about Mate. The summary of the Mueller report has been a massive embarrassment to groups like New Knowledge, the scam operatives I was talking about, and everyone else who supported Russiagate. Reading Mate's stories in the Nation is like reading a running commentary on what's wrong with the corporate media on the 2016 U.S. election, what's wrong with Russiagate, and thus explaining some good reasons why the public is fully justified in not trusting the media. It's also shameful that both Democracy Now! And The Real News are either pro-Russiagate or weak on Russiagate, and both our news organizations Mate quit after disagreements with their respective management over Russiagate coverage. That is, supposedly furthest left mainstream media are just as bad. Russian sanctions were based in part on Russiagate. The sanctions against Russia, of course, are a war on the populace, not the government. The sanctions hurt ordinary Russians. The sanctions the U.S. put on Russian business are the sorts of things that harm the public. Russian sanctions are based in part on Russiagate allegations, which dominated corporate-compatible news coverage of Russia and the Trump administration for over 2 years. This can't be allowed to go away with a dismissive hand wave and shifting the goalpost to what about Trump's finances, which is where the Democrats and their friends are now after the apparent subsiding of Russiagate. It is a wilderness of mirrors, and we keep getting the same reflections. The reflections are of liars.
Yeah, it's very complicated in some ways, probably personal at a personal level as well as political level. I don't agree that the Real News Network went Russiagate. I think when Aaron left, they just did less investigative journalism. He took his journalism with him. And I don't think, Paul Jay has been the man I referred to before in regards to his interviews with Gore Vidal and so forth, has never bought into the Russiagate. I don't know what the editorial decision was to perhaps do less reporting on that. But
Jeff calls him weak on Russiagate. So
meaning Mate left and didn't do the kind of reporting for the Real News Network that he's been doing for the Nation.
Since Democracy Now! Also called weak on Russiagate.
Probably certainly more weak, I would think, but I don't really watch that all that. I don't watch that, so I don't.
I had an interesting report from a friend of mine in Boston who heard a wildly popular presentation the other night in a downtown Boston church where the Noam Chomsky spoke. Noam used to live in Boston and doesn't anymore. Noam Chomsky spoke there in a session chaired by, what's her name? Democracy Now!
Amy Goodman.
Amy Goodman.
Yeah.
And he said that Amy appeared nervous and uncomfortable and talked far too long before Noam did. Whether there was any real confrontation between the two of them, I haven't heard. But I can't help but think that the temporizing by Amy Goodman had something to do with the weakness of Democracy Now!'s account of the Russiagate affair.
And a lot of other things as well.
Well, that could be true.
And, of course, Amy Goodman, along with David Barsamian, were the two people who were most responsible for popularizing Noam Chomsky, for better popularizing
That's a good
Noam
point.
Chomsky, going back to probably the 1980s. So that has to be said. The other kind of interesting thing, and I don't read the Intercept articles all that much, but there's some interesting cross currents that would seem to be emerging from that website in relation to Laura Poitras, the woman who made the film about Edward Snowden, and how all that plays out and who had some and who's sort of one of Amy Goodman's comrades in that context. But Laura Poitras, I think, had some issues with Julian Assange at some point, and I'm not sure how all that's playing out. And then there's Glenn Greenwald, who writes from this very hard libertarian point of view about Russiagate and so forth. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Intercept covers these things as they've been playing out. Although I don't keep that close of an eye on it, but I think our researcher probably does, and probably will let us know what's going on over there.
One of the other sources for consideration of real news on these matters is the website TruthDig. And I recommend that too. I'll put a couple of those on the Facebook page. I should add that TruthDig is not to be confused with Truth Out.
Right.
Truth Out, they're similar operations. They aggregate political content and produce the things that you won't see in the New York Times and the Washington Post for the most part. But they're very different. Truth Out was described by the late Alexander Cockburn as truth left out. And it purports to be a muckraking operation like TruthDig. TruthDig is that. Truth Out isn't that.
TruthDig is identified with the sort of legendary journalist Robert Scheer, who I think in his work goes back to the 1960s and Ramparts, and I'm sure who has had a lot to do with Daniel Ellsberg in his lifetime. And so you would expect TruthDig to be very good on these kinds of issues.
But TruthDig also features Chris Hedges, who has a
peculiar,
but he has a good piece on
good
on the wider.
I thought that was going to be your next.
Well, it's, what it requires is a sort of consideration and evaluation that the American media are at pains to prevent you from doing.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. I mean, Chris Hedges is definitely good on freedom of speech issues, and he's definitely, I mean, when it comes to his journalism, to his own experience as a dissident journalist, he's going to be on the right side of things.
But I recommend his piece in TruthDig and TruthDig in general. He writes yesterday, "The arrest Thursday of Julian Assange eviscerates all pretense of the rule of law and the rights of free press. The illegalities embraced by the Ecuadorian, British, and U.S. governments in the seizure of Assange are ominous. They presage a world where the internal workings, abuses, corruption, lies, and crimes, especially war crimes, carried out by corporate states and the global ruling elite will be masked from the public. They presage a world where those with the courage and integrity to expose the misuse of power will be hunted down, tortured, subjected to sham trials, and given lifetime prison terms in solitary confinement. They presage an Orwellian dystopia where news is replaced with propaganda, trivia, and entertainment." Does that sound familiar? "The arrest of Assange, I fear, marks the official beginning of the corporate totalitarianism that will define our lives." Might wonder whether official beginning is quite right, but certainly an escalation in that seems to be underway. It is not a good sign.
And of course, all this comes in the wake of the re-imprisonment of Chelsea Manning for refusing to testify before a grand jury about some of the issues that involved Julian Assange's request. He's being accused. From what I understand, the charge against him is the charge against him has to do with requesting information from government sources, or the thing that they're trying to do is accuse him of not doing journalism, of going beyond doing journalism.
They say he stole a password.
Yeah.
They say he stole a password and used it with Manning in order to steal secret materials from the U.S. government. Now, what that secret material was, of course, were accounts of crimes committed by Americans in war and war crimes by the American government in general. So what they're trying to turn into a
Sort of technical, sort of
well,
legalistic.
yeah, the notion that they're just after Assange. There are complex problems here having to do with extradition. The British government, for a variety of reasons, has some hesitation about extraditing people who might face the death penalty. And that's involved in this matter because although the U.S. has used this charge of stealing a password to get Assange extradited, there is no indication that the U.S. won't pile further charges on once they have Assange in their hands. And those charges could indeed lead to death penalties, lead to a death penalty under specifically the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act is the 1917 law passed by Congress to suppress criticism of the First World War. It had nothing to do, or very little to do, with espionage in the sense of spying, but what it wanted to do was shut up people like the Eugene Debs, who were criticizing America's entry into the First World War, something that the New York bankers and their president, Woodrow Wilson, very much wanted to do. So the idea is that the U.S. government will use a lesser charge to get the British government to send them Assange, and then once Assange is in America, he can be given far stronger charges that would not be compatible with extradition from the UK under British law. It is a particularly vicious system, and the goal is clear. The goal is to shut up people who might reveal American crimes. And that's why the Assange matter is as important as it is, and the U.S. government looks like winning.
Yeah, just a brief quote here from Jeffrey St. Clair in Counterpunch this morning. The main difference between the anonymous leaks from U.S. intelligence officials about Russiagate, peddled nightly on MSDNC, which he calls it MSNBC,
Yeah, right.
CNN, and the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the difference between that and Julian Assange's exposure of U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan is that what WikiLeaks published turned out to be true.
Yes.
In this system, you're only held accountable for exposing the truth about imperial power.
Hedges continues, I'm sure government attorneys, U.S. government attorneys, of course, are skillfully doing what has become de rigueur for the corporate state, using specious legal arguments to eviscerate enshrined rights by judicial fiat. This is how we have the right to privacy with no privacy. This is how we have free elections funded by corporate money, covered by a compliant corporate media, and under iron corporate control. This is how we have a legislative process in which corporate lobbyists write the legislation and corporate indentured politicians vote it into law. This is how we have the right to due process with no due process. This is how we have a government whose fundamental responsibility is to protect citizens, that orders and carries out the assassinations of its own citizens, such as the radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son. This is how we have a press legally permitted to publish classified information and a publisher sitting in jail in Britain awaiting extradition to the United States and a whistleblower, Chelsea Manning, in a jail cell in the United States. This is, in the old SDS motto, everything is connected, and we should not simply look at the peculiar case or even the peculiar personality of Julian Assange as merely a matter of interest here with no influence on the vicious activities of the British and American governments.
So as long as we're piling on here, One more quote from this morning's Counterpunch. Benoit Kampmark, a regular columnist there, a fellow named Benoit Kampmark. I don't know if we've ever mentioned him. He writes very good stuff on Counterpunch, and a lot of it. He wrote, even if he, meaning Julian Assange, has never been fully accepted within the fraternity of the press, to say the least.
Yes,
He has in many ways led its change. His forensic style of journalism, with its techniques of placing original documentation upon sites for readers to consult, has brought greater scrutiny of sources. His embrace of secure systems for sending classified material and his pioneering of international cross-border collaborative reporting transformed the nature of modern journalism. But pioneers tend to find themselves in the Colosseum facing the hungry lions of state. The pursuit of Assange, as British Labour's Diane Abbott quite accurately assessed, was not done, quote, to protect U.S. national security, but because he has exposed wrongdoing by U.S. administrations and their military forces, end the quote from Diane Abbott. And then he quotes former Greek finance minister and rabble-rousing economist Yanis Varoufakis, who said, the game is up. Years of lies exposed. It was never about Sweden, Putin, Trump, or Hillary. Assange was persecuted for exposing war crimes.
Yes,
End
exactly.
quote. And then Kampmark finishes, punish Assange, punish the press, punish. This is getting hard to say. Punish Assange and condemn the fourth estate, meaning the press.
The Trump administration will seek to try Assange on charges that he conspired with Manning in 2010 to steal the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs obtained by WikiLeaks. The 500,000 internal documents leaked by Manning from the Pentagon and the State Department, along with a 2007 video of U.S. helicopter pilots nonchalantly gunning down Iraqi civilians, including children, and 2 Reuters journalists, provided copious evidence of the hypocrisy, indiscriminate violence, and routine use of torture, lies, bribery, and crude tactics of intimidation by the U.S. government in its foreign relations and wars in the Middle East. Assange and WikiLeaks allowed us to see the inner workings of empire, the most important role of a press, and for this, they became empire's prey. That's what we're dealing with here. The government will stop at nothing to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't occur.
And this is trivial in relation to what we've been saying, but I have to sort of refer again that the charges against Assange, the part of the campaign, of course, was to label Assange as basically a rapist in terms of the Sweden issue, and that was a pretty effective tactic in allowing some people on the so-called left to distance themselves from that. And that is partly what's going on with Amy Goodman. I mean, I think I know enough, even though I don't watch it regularly anymore. I keep an eye on the website. I look at the stories. I read the transcripts of the stories, that a few of the stories. But there's something about that whole business and who Assange is as a person, the way he's been presented in that context, that allows part of the so-called left some wiggle room in distancing themselves from him. Although I don't think that's gonna hold out in this context.
Assange, who with the Manning leaks had exposed the war crimes, lies, and criminal manipulations of the Bush administration, soon earned the ire of the Democratic Party establishment by publishing 70,000 hacked emails belonging to the Democratic National Committee and senior Democratic officials. The emails were copied from the accounts of John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman. The Podesta emails exposed the donation of millions of dollars from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, 2 of the major funders of Islamic State, to the Clinton Foundation. It exposed the $657,000 that Goldman Sachs paid to Hillary Clinton to give talks, a sum so large it could only be considered a bribe. It exposed Clinton's repeated mendacity. She was caught in the emails, for example, telling the financial elites that she wanted, quote, open trade and open borders, and believed Wall Street executives were best positioned to manage the economy, a statement that contradicted her campaign statements. It exposed the Clinton campaign's efforts to influence the Republican primaries to ensure that Trump was the Republican nominee. The ironies here are great, of course. The complaints are that that was what Russia was doing. No, in fact, it's what the Clinton campaign was doing. It exposed Clinton's advanced knowledge of questions in a primary debate. It exposed Clinton as the primary architect of the war in Libya, a war she believed would burnish her credentials as a presidential candidate. Journalists can argue that this information, like the war logs, should have remained hidden, but they can't then call themselves journalists. Now, the Democratic leadership, still the leadership of the Democratic Party today, intent on blaming Russia for its election loss, that's the point of Russiagate, charges that the Podesta emails were obtained by Russian government hackers, although James Comey, the former FBI director, has conceded the emails were probably diverted to WikiLeaks by an intermediary. Assange has said the emails were not provided by state actors. What we're dealing with here is the murder of Seth Rich.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah, which may have been another Democratic Party campaign operation.
You know, Carl, let's go on record here. Tell the world what you think about Seth Rich. You know,
I think that the emails were not hacked by the Russians at all. They were released by Seth Rich, an idealistic young man who was shocked at what his Democratic Party that he was working for was doing, and decided that the best way to do that was to expose what was going on here, just as Chelsea Manning thought the same thing.
And you think he got killed for that?
And I think he got killed for that.
Okay,
I think the Democratic Party was responsible for his murder.
Don't say that we don't say that we don't go out on any limbs and news from Neptune.
That's it's the Seth Rich case. The Seth Rich case has been condemned all over. Any mention of Seth Rich has been called a conspiracy theory. Exactly. The real facts may show that in this case the conspiracy theory is quite correct.
How is it that you think the real facts haven't come out in all this time?
Because
in almost 3 years?
Because of tremendous efforts in the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign and their tame media, who are horrified by the rise of populism in the last presidential election, to make sure the story doesn't get told.
Has anyone ever been charged with the murder of Seth Rich?
Oh, no. I mean, it hasn't even been investigated. Everything from the Democratic Party's email servers to the actual circumstances of the shooting of Rich on a Washington street, which was dismissed immediately as a street crime, but the street criminal didn't bother to take any of Seth's personal effects that you think a street criminal would be interested in, like his wallet, his cell phone, his jewelry, things like that. All of that was still there as he died. We got to get out of here. You've been watching news from Neptune for the 15th week of 2019, the week of the martyrdom of Julian Assange, his arrest by British police, a flagrant violation of international law, signals the ongoing destruction of a free press by the U.S. government to hide its crimes. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young with Andrew Scollery. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.